We next have the behavior of cheatgrass with, it says Scott Nissen, but I assume that's Professor Scott Nissen, Professor Emeritus SCSU Weed Science. And Joe, you're going to introduce, I assume.
Yeah. I'm brand new at this, so.
So am I. So we're on even ground here.
Let's see. I might need to be your clicker. I might need, let's see here. Find the right port here, put my glasses on so everybody knows how old I am. Let's see here.
And if you guys will start too by introducing yourselves and then the topic, that'd be great. When you're ready. No hurry, no pressure.
So, good evening, everybody. I am Joe Swanson.
In the microphone, please. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I am Joe Swanson. I am the Parks and Open Space Senior Invasive Plant Supervisor at Boulder County. And we are beginning the process of revising our weed management plan, as you are aware. And an aspect of that is cheatgrass management. So tonight I'm here to introduce Scott Nissen, CSU Professor Emeritus, who has roughly 30 years of experience in research, applied research with the control of cheatgrass and various other invasive plants in agriculture, in aquatics, in native open spaces. So with that.
Great, thank you, Joe. And welcome, Dr. Nissen.
Everybody hear me? I mean, I can't tell if I'm amplifying or not.
I think you're good.
Okay. Joe, why don't you hit the first slide? I wanted to kind of give my background. I mean, Joe gave a very quick overview, but to let people know that, you know, as an undergraduate, I was a botany major. From there, I did soil science and agronomy. I did my PhD at Montana State with a minor, well, crop science with a minor in biochemistry. As Joe said, I've been doing this for a long time and got into weed science kind of as a secondary interest. I was very interested in plants, and there aren't a lot of jobs for people who are straight botanists. So if you take weed science as basically applied botany, it becomes a very viable alternative. I came from University of Nebraska to Colorado State in 1995. Came as an assistant professor, went through the whole ranks, assistant, associate, full professor, and now I retired in December 2021. And but still, I stay active. I've been going to the regional meetings and still do a little bit of contract research. As Joe mentioned, I've done a lot of things. It would be nice to have the ability to specialize in one area, but weeds don't allow you to do that. And being an extension person as well as teaching and research, I decided that I really didn't have that luxury. There's so many questions that our constituents want us to answer. So I've done just about everything from specialty crops. So I worked on onions, potatoes, sugar beets, a little work on carrots, dry beans, range of natural area work, bare ground, roadside, right-of-way sort of things. 2006, I started working in aquatics, and at the time I started, people said, well, we only have a few sites of Eurasian water milfoil here in Colorado. But as anybody who works in weeds knows, as soon as you start looking for a particular weed, you'll find it in a lot of different places. And so probably had one of the best research programs in the West after about 3 or 4 years of working in aquatics. But the picture up in the corner is a Eurasian water milfoil that we pulled out of a irrigation ditch here in Boulder County. So with that, I think we'll go on to the next one there, Joe. That explains enough. Okay, we are here to talk about downy brome, and that's one of the probably most invasive species that we have to deal with. It's kind of weird to think that a simple little winter annual could be so invasive, but the problem is we really have no other native winter annual grasses that would compete directly with it. And so there's this big open niche that allows cheatgrass to flourish and spread. And it's easily spread by, people moving equipment, animals moving around. When a fire gets started and somebody, Forest Service goes in and has a vehicle that's contaminated. They've only recently started very serious decontamination after they're on site for a fire. But you can see here, this is in metric, so I'll convert that for you. It's about 55 million acres in the U.S. are affected or impacted by downy brome. All right, there seemed to be some question. Joe mentioned that, is there really a relationship between cheatgrass infestations and fire? So I thought I would at least put that to rest and say, yes, it's a very definite correlation, very positive. So if you have cheatgrass, you have a much higher likelihood of having a hot, fast-moving fire because you've got a continuous fuel source for the fire to carry. So I just cited this is an extension publication from CSU. It's not from my department. This is from the Department of Natural Resources. So you can read on your own. It basically says the same thing over there on the other side. Did a little research. You know, if you aren't convinced, just go to Google Scholar, type in the words cheatgrass and fire. You'll find about 300 publications. I even managed to come across one from my competitive university, CU. And so if you want to see that even CU agrees that this is a serious problem and there's a direct correlation between cheatgrass and the frequency and intensity of wildfires. All right. Now, we often try to go up a trophic level or two. You know, people say, well, you're just a plant person or a weed person. You know, you don't really know what impacts this has long term. But if you look at, this is a source from the University of Arizona. It's a consortium of most of the western states, a couple other entities that help support it. But sage grouse is really seriously impacted by cheatgrass because the fires that are produced by cheatgrass are hot enough that it actually kills sagebrush. And so sage grouse need sagebrush, about 40 to 50% sagebrush cover to survive. They rely on it for food and cover and protection. So whole areas of the east, or say western Colorado and Utah and Nevada and all those places, southern Wyoming, they're doing a lot of work trying to restore these habitats for the sage grouse. And you can, I'm sure Joe's talked about some of the work they've done with, you know, with elk and deer and all those kind of things for, you know, improving habitat. So as I mentioned, we don't have a native species that can compete directly with cheatgrass. And I think I've got a couple more slides that kind of describe that. I'd like to talk about thatch because that's what's driving the wildfires. And here's the slide I've shown here shows, I'm trying to think which side would that be. On the one side that says high fire risk, that way I won't get left and right mixed up. That's fairly typical. And what people don't realize is the presence of that thatch makes it easier for the cheatgrass to establish the next year. So the seeds of cheatgrass will actually be hung up in that thatch. The thatch actually makes a nice environment with high humidity, high soil moisture, protection from the environment pretty much, and the seeds can actually germinate in that thatch layer. So what happens is it just keeps getting thicker and thicker and thicker until a wildfire comes along, and then the whole process starts over. People have talked about fire as being, you know, a way to manage cheatgrass. It really doesn't manage cheatgrass. What it does, which can be very helpful, is a good low intensity prescribed fire can have a very rejuvenative effect on the native species. But you're only going to get about 1 or 2 years of cheatgrass control from even a modest wildfire. So what these sites should look like is the one that says low fire risk. There should be a lot of space between all these bunch grasses. Interestingly enough, and I didn't know this, but that bare ground is also prime habitat for native pollinators. A lot of our native pollinators are not beautiful butterflies flying around or bees. They're actually insects that live underground. And so they need bare ground in order to be able to complete their life cycle and do what pollinators do. All right, this is just a slide to show you that the reason that cheatgrass is so competitive is that it uses up all the soil moisture, or most of it. And the other interesting thing about cheatgrass, it's very compensatory in its growth habit, meaning in a dry year or high density, the plants will be fairly small and only produce a few seeds. But in a year like this, you go out, you'll find a cheatgrass plant that probably has 100 tillers and maybe produces 10,000 seeds from a single plant. So when the moisture and the conditions are right, it can really explode because its ability to sort of adapt to whatever conditions, it's faced with. And this slide just shows that most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with kochia, which should probably be our native. No, we can't say it would replace our state flower, but it could, as far as the number of places that you find it, because I've dealt with cheatgrass no matter whether I'm trying to grow sugar beets or whether we're trying to plant native species. You're always going to have a problem with cheatgrass or with kochia. And this just shows in the middle of that slide where the cheatgrass has become established and has used up all the soil moisture. Not even the kochia can compete with the cheatgrass. The cheatgrass or the kochia on the side is growing in an area without cheatgrass. So it just shows you how competitive it is. Okay, I threw this slide in because many people may or may not be convinced of the severity of the problem. This is what parts of Nevada look like, where there is absolutely nothing left but a monoculture of cheatgrass. And this leads us to the idea, how could we possibly come up with a strategy that does what we need to do? And this is an annual plant, right? So every year it's dependent on seeds for the next generation. So the most important thing we need to understand is what are the dynamics of the soil seed bank? All right, and I've highlighted that just to show you. And if you don't, and I don't expect you to know, this would be something I'm teaching in the undergraduate class, but the soil seed bank, the reason it's called a bank is because it works very much the same way, right? The plant deposits seeds whenever it produces viable seed, and then sometime in the future it withdraws those seeds from the soil to produce the next generation. And this shows some of the dynamics. Not all seeds are viable, not all plants live long enough to produce seed. A lot of seeds are attacked by insects or decay by soil bacteria or fungi, those kind of things. There's predation. So in the case of cheatgrass, it always seems like there's enough seed for the next generation. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a project that we did, because what I'm describing here is kind of a two-part process. We needed to understand the soil seed bank, so we actually established a series of experiments in which we used Roundup in the early spring to try to control or kill all the cheatgrass so it couldn't produce seed, right? And we did that for 1 year, 2 years in a row, 3 years in a row, 4 years in a row, 5 years in a row. And then we went back at the end of that 5th year and we collected soil samples from these different sites or plots, took them into the greenhouse and to figure out what's still left alive in the soil seed bank. And you can see that once, until you get to about 3 applications, you really don't see any difference between the use of glyphosate to kill, or Roundup to kill all the cheatgrass, until you get to that 4th year. All right, so it took 4 years of control to actually deplete the soil seed bank of cheatgrass seed. That's the first part of this process. Now we understand what we need to do in order to get a handle on the problem with cheatgrass. Now you'll notice that in that 4 year, there are a few little green things. And when we don't water the plants every day, but when we walked into the greenhouse and saw those at the 4th year, our hearts kind of sank a little bit because we thought we were there. And it turned out those were actually native grass seed. So we had done it. At that 4th year, we had completely depleted the soil seed bank. Okay. And we've published that. That's peer-reviewed in Rangeland Ecology and Management if you're interested in all the gory details. Okay, now, this is part 2 of the process. Until 2010, we really did not have an economical way to get to this 4 years of weed control. It would take plateau for 4 years in a row or something like that in order to get to this. In 2010, Bayer Crop Science introduced a new product, a new herbicide that they marketed for very expensive crops in California. So this was labeled on pistachios, walnuts, in vineyards, any of these very high value perennial crops. Well, I noticed on the label that they also listed downy brome as one of the weeds that this product controlled. And so in 2010, at CSU, we started research looking at the potential of this product to give us that multi-year control of the cheatgrass seed bank. And our results were so promising that we were able to, and this, I know there seems to be some issue about, you know, who pays for what and where funding comes from. That seems to be a big issue. But the early part of this work was done basically just by money we already had at CSU. So then we took the results of this research and we developed more and more positive research results, took it to Bayer, and they went ahead and looked at it, asked us to do a little bit more work because they're, you know, most of these companies are very risk averse. They don't want to have any adverse effects. And it wasn't too long before they realized that this was really the potential. This was the second part of the puzzle. The first part was knowing how long we had to control cheatgrass. The second part was actually having a product or a herbicide that could give us that long of residual control. Okay, so you probably heard of Rejuvera. That wasn't the original name. It was called Allion, and then it was called Esplanade, and it's Bayer sold off the part of the company that was doing this work, and you know that's pretty complicated. But
can you tell us what Rejuvera is? I don't know what it is.
What it in Daziflam is the active ingredient.
So it's an herbicide?
It's an herbicide, okay. Yes. Yeah. And the reason I use this term shift in paradigm is because we've never had a product that was soil active and very limited soil activity. So this diagram shows you that basically the herbicide is staying right there in the upper surface of the soil. It's very lipophilic. It's very, it adheres very strongly to organic matter and clay content of the soil. So you essentially separate the herbicide from the roots of the perennial plants. So all the cheatgrass is sitting there right either in the thatch or right up there at the soil surface. And this herbicide is keeping those plants from establishing by inhibiting their ability to produce cellulose. Okay, that's pretty specific just to plants. So it was a totally new mode of action to be used in range and natural areas, a different paradigm shift to be able to put something on that provided soil activity and not foliar activity. So that adds to its selectivity. Okay, so, you know, at the university, how do you get promoted? How do you keep your job? You do research and you publish. You guys probably, I'm sure, are all well aware of that. And so we just, you know, we had this idea that not only could it control cheatgrass, but it also might be active on other plants. Oh, one interesting thing is that of all the plants out there that we tested, cheatgrass actually turned out to be the most sensitive. Have you heard of Arabidopsis? You know what Arabidopsis is? That very simple plant that all the molecular people use, that they call a weed, but it's really, if you look at it wrong, it dies. Even it is more tolerant to this herbicide than is cheatgrass. So it's just one of these very serendipitous events that a weed we're very interested also happens to be one of the most sensitive. So we, you know, had looked at winter annual grasses. We've done looking at it to extend the control of other species that are dependent on seed production. So biennials, short-lived perennials. You know, one thing we never knew before was if something failed, was it because we didn't get control of the root system? We didn't know that in many cases it was coming back from the soil seed bank. So this allowed us to kind of explore that. So, okay, let's talk about some of the things that we've done that might interest people, especially, you know, we don't just want to control cheatgrass, we want something back in its place, right? Something native if possible. Sometimes natives aren't the best option. I did a big project with DIA, and they don't want anything that would attract wildlife, so they want you to plant a very aggressive grass species that nothing will eat, you know, so it's a very weird paradigm to kind of get your head around this idea. But this is some work we did near Fort Collins. This is a beautiful site. It was an old farm that's taken over by, or is now run by the Division of Wildlife. Beautiful soil, about sandy loam, about 4% organic matter. You couldn't do much better for Colorado soil. We had a series of experiments where we applied the Daziflam in the spring. We kept the site fairly, the herbicide did most of the work, kept the site weed free for quite a while. Then in the fall, we seeded different grasses and forbs. Now, we don't want them to come up in the fall. We just want them to be in the ground and dormant until spring. Okay, so this is what happened. We were very lucky. We had a spring just almost identical to this one, a lot of moisture. In fact, this was 2015. We actually had 1.5 inches of rain that fell in July at this site. So we got lucky. But you can see here we've got some sand drop seed. We've got, let's see what else. We got green needlegrass. We've got some summer annuals like little blue stem. We've got some forbs, fringe sage, a few other things, Maximilian sunflower. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things that came up and were able to establish because there was no competition from the cheatgrass. Okay, fast forward. I took this picture just about a week ago. This is 8 years after application. And you can still see a lot of the areas that we seeded, and they're doing extremely well. You can see there we've got a line of basin wild rye, and on the other side you can see this huge patch of western wheatgrass that established and has now started to take over as it creeps along. But this is 8 years without cheatgrass from a single application. Okay, now the other thing I think there was some interest in is aerial applications. I know that always gets some discussion going, to put it mildly. In eastern Colorado, they are doing a lot of aerial applications, fixed wing with Rejuvra. And this is a little tour I went to. The young woman's back, you can see right there, was one of my grad students. And so they just went out and stripped out these 1 or 2 mile long strips, single passes. And you can see that the guy in the cowboy hat and the blue shirt is basically standing right on the line between a treated and non-treated. This I think is the year after application. So just look at and the diversity in those sites that were treated is pretty astounding compared to those plants that are trying to compete with cheatgrass. So this has been very rewarding. I would say that it's probably been one of the highlights of my career. I've got a string of grad students I'm extremely proud of. But this really is something where there was a need. We did the research and developed a solution. It's not a cheap solution, but it is something that works. And these growers are realizing, these are ranchers out in eastern Colorado. This is Sterling, Colorado, that they can actually graze more cattle. They don't have to buy more land because the land they have is going to be able to handle more cow-calf pairs. It's just been a win-win, and you can basically think about amortizing the expense over multiple years. And then it doesn't, it's not quite as expensive. We at first thought, well, there's no way that this is going to work for up to 8 or 9 years. I mean, there's probably going to have to be one retreatment. But so far, we're not really seeing that that's the case, except if there's been a skip or something like that where the product didn't get on the ground. I was really surprised because this is only 2.5 gallons of water per acre from an aircraft, doing 120 miles an hour, and it still worked, which really surprised me. I thought for sure they would probably have to use helicopters at 10 or 15 gallons per acre. So what else we got there? Okay, this comes right from Boulder County. I'm sure you've seen these slides, but one of the big benefits, if you're interested in pollinators, not only is it the open ground where these ground nesting pollinators can live, but without competition, those native forbs that are there produce more flowers per plant. That's kind of a no-brainer. You give a plant room to grow without competition for moisture, and you're going to get more flowers per plant. And this is just some data from, I think, some work that Orthy did, who was a faculty member at CSU, a pollinator expert, and this is just a single slide from that. Okay, any questions? I saw this was on.
So,
Okay, you got to answer this question first.
okay,
if
well,
there's-
I could answer that
Okay,
question
all
easily, since I graduated before you started at CSU. But thank you, Dr. Nissen. And I want to just both open this up, questions from POSAC members and then the public, but I also want to make sure that what the questions we should be asking is clarification questions, right? Understanding, if you didn't understand parts of the presentation, if you want to go deeper on parts of the presentation. I'm not as interested in looking for a debate about whether Rejuvera is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. This is more of a session for both us and the public to say, I have questions about the application. I have questions about the longevity.
Recording in progress.
Cool. And so that's how I want to frame this for folks, not as a debate really about whether we're going to see the use of Rejuvera on county lands or not. So with that in mind, let me open it up to POSAC members first, and then we'll include the public and get comfortable because we've got probably a fair amount of questions. Questions from y'all, because I have plenty, but Janet?
Okay.
I can see it in your eyes, so please.
Janet George, POSAC. Thanks for the great presentation. I knew a little bit about Rejuva and the history, but it was good to see it come from a really personal standpoint. So I got a number of questions, and I saw, going back to the Nevada picture, so a lot of the work and a lot of the real concerns from a wildlife standpoint and comes from the Great Basin, where cheatgrass, so it's a way different type of weather system. Do we see that kind of density of cheatgrass and that kind of situation here on the Front Range, not Sterling, which again has a different climate, but do we see it more here on the Front Range?
Yes, yes. The picture was from Nunn Road, which is just north of, or a little bit east of Wellington.
Yeah.
So that cheatgrass density was very intense, and there was already a layer of thatch, probably 4 to 6 inches thick. So yes, in fact, with a year like this, we are going to have massive amounts of thatch, which will start to dry down if it ever stops raining. But it will. This will be an astronomical year for the production of thatch. Let me just mention one thing about the Great Basin. I did a presentation in Ely, Nevada, if you know where that is. A couple of researchers from the University of Nevada, Reno, were there, and they basically said, look, we can tell you exactly when we're going to have a bad fire year, because it will be 2 years after we've had an El Nino. El Nino for Nevada means they get storms coming up like through Las Vegas, LA. So this, let's see, this is 2023. So in 25, they will have some massive wildfires. The problem with the wildfires is that if they burn hot enough, that's when you kill the shrubs. And it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be sagebrush. It could be four-winged saltbush. It could be bitterbrush. It could be kind of hard to kill rabbit brush, but you probably could if the fire was hot enough. And once you lose these these shrubs, that really changes the whole makeup of the ecosystem. So yes, we definitely have enough to carry a hot fire. And in case, I know that Joe can probably speak to this, but I know some of the prescribed burns that have been done actually burned hotter than they had hoped because of the fuel load provided by the cheatgrass. And so you really don't want a very hot fire, because if that crown of the shrub gets impacted, it doesn't come back. Now, Joe and I were talking before, I can tell you that tamarisk will come back. You can burn it right to the ground, and it will, within 6 months, you'll have a bush. But these shrubs are not we may be a little bit more fire adapted than, say, the Great Basin, but not that much more. And in our system, there shouldn't be a bunch of fuel in between all the bunch grasses, which is what we have now with cheatgrass.
So following along on the Nun, it was encouraging to hear at your Nun site that once you applied it and you planted some native seeds and they came up, what I understood was 8 years later, you still didn't have cheatgrass. It was actually the native plants were competing. So if you or Joe could kind of paint a picture of how this would be applied on open space, I mean, are we talking about once you got cheatgrass under control, maybe not totally eradicated, but did a lot of work, are we looking at periodically having to retreat, or will the native plants outcompete it and keep cheatgrass from reestablishing again?
Once you've eliminated that seed bank, it has no way of coming back unless somebody brings it in, okay? I guess one of the problems we have seen is that then you have to be ready to control some of the weedy forbs like kochia. But kochia is also a very short-lived soil seed bank plant. In fact, the seeds are what we call a naked seed. They really don't even have a seed coat. They're very short-lived. So again, you've got, the only thing you'd have to deal with would be kochia, and it's actually not that difficult to deal with. So this site up in Nunn Road, as I said, has been free of cheatgrass for over 8 years, which I never thought I was gonna be happy if we get to 3, and then we had to think about retreatment. But to get to 8 and not see any cheatgrass coming in, it's been really, really encouraging.
Okay. Just a couple more questions.
Sure.
I don't want to take up all the time. Okay. So have you been involved or anybody done any long-term or even short-term studies on managing cheatgrass with grazing? Like I'm thinking cattle, or very intense grazing, spring grazing with cattle or horses.
Oh yeah, well I know Paul Myman, who is no longer at CSU. He's at the University of Nevada, Reno, out in Elko. I used to make fun of him in my class because his solution to every problem is grazing, because he's a range guy. So there is a ton of literature on grazing cheatgrass. The problem is the window where it's palatable and is worth it to move cattle in is very short, and you have to graze it intensively and be ready to move cattle very quickly, and that's just not feasible. And same with fire. Fire makes a great setup treatment. If it's not too intense, you actually get a stimulation of the native plants because you've released some nutrients into the soil that were tied up in all that thatch. I had a student that worked on a project, and the combination of fire plus something like Rejuver is a great combination. And it's best to put on the Rejuver after the fire because now you're going to have the herbicide getting to the soil rather than being hung up on all the litter that's there. So we've tried to answer all those basic questions. Like people were often asking, should we burn first and then apply Rejuver? Can we apply Rejuver if there's thatch? Basically, the problem with having thatch there is you need to go with the highest possible use rate because, probably 40 to 60% of it gets tied up in the litter and never makes it to the soil.
So with the
Go deeper on the grazing.
So on the grazing though, has there been success with grazing alone, high intensity, short duration? Has there been a success alone at controlling cheatgrass, and how long does it take? Because I know grazing sometimes takes a lot longer than other methods.
I do not know of any case in which the cheatgrass was ever eradicated. What I know is that it would just became a source of forage for the rancher. And then what you have to realize, the other thing is that cattle are not grazing with tweezers, right? So if there is a patch and maybe it's only 20% cheatgrass cover and the rest is native grass, they don't go in there because it's too much work to get the forage they need. They don't have the mouth parts. They're not like a giraffe or something where they can just go in and wrap their tongue around something. So even if you have 15 or 20% cheatgrass cover, that is basically lost to a cattle rancher. The problem with, and I said before, the literature is full of ways to utilize cheatgrass as a forage and when to utilize it. But none of this research ever said we got rid of the cheatgrass by grazing it. We're stuck with it, so we used it as a forage resource.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll be done at this point. Now, I got a question, but it might be for another meeting.
Okay, or you can hold it and, come back to
Hold
it.
it.
All right.
But thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah.
Other questions from POSAC members? Christy, I can see it. I can feel it.
I'm thinking about a CONIPS presentation that Joe presented at in March, and which there was a compelling study about grazing and cheatgrass done by USDA researchers in Nebraska. It might be interesting for us to drag that up.
Well, you were talking, remember, that's going to be warm season.
Mm-hmm.
So totally different environment. If you're in Nebraska, you're in a warm season dominated system and much, much higher rainfall. So if we're trying to compare apples to apples, even western Nebraska probably gets 20 to 25 inches of rainfall. When I was at the University of Nebraska, I did a lot of work in the Sandhills around Valentine, Nebraska. So I know that area very, pretty well. So it's not quite, if you're trying to make a comparison to the Front Range, it's not necessarily the best. I don't want to interrupt and say what you're proposing is not correct. I'm just saying those are very different locations.
It just came to mind after Janet's questions. Is there evidence of sites transitioning to monocultures of cheatgrass in Colorado on the Front Range or in Boulder County? Is cheatgrass, is it stable? Is it increasing? I'm curious about that 55 million acres.
55 million acres, yeah.
And what happens if you eliminate in one spot? I mean, it seems like there's a tremendous seed bank just waiting to blow in.
Yeah. We're fairly lucky in the Front Range that we're a little bit earlier in the process of managing cheatgrass. So I don't know of any sites that have really totally converted to cheatgrass. You can find sites that were, well, I'll tell you, the Nunn Road site, I don't know what was there before, but when we started our work, it was 100% cheatgrass cover. So I don't know if that meant that it was a crop field that was never managed. I don't know the history. We started working there in like 2010 or something like that. Maybe Joe has an example of somewhere where it's transitioned totally. In Nevada, the transition has been pretty dramatic, mainly because of the fire frequency. Great Basin fires should only happen about once every 30 to 50 years, and now it's happening about once every 10 years. And that's had a tremendous impact.
Tremendous impact in what sense?
Impacting the sagebrush and the native vegetation. Yeah, so it's basically those fires, that fire frequency has converted it from a perennial grass, perennial shrub dominated system to annual grass system. So do you know if we have any sites that have?
I don't know if I'd say Boulder County there may be some localized areas that are 100%, but I think, we're probably looking at some of our worst sites at 75, 80%. I mean, we can usually walk a cheatgrass site, and find some natives, which is actually what we're looking for, because when we do a treatment, it's that remnant native plant base that we're looking for to try to extend and bring back to life and revitalize. And so when we get into areas with 60, 70, 80%, but we still usually find some of our native plants in there. But we have some of our best results in those areas because the native plant base is there. It only takes one growing season. So if we can apply the previous year just over winter, we've done a few applications in wintertime when things are dormant, where we can kill out the cheatgrass. In as little as 4 months, we've seen an absolute total transformation from a cheatgrass site to a high diversity native plant system that's restoring our ecosystems and ecology on a lot of these open spaces. And I was just going to comment just one point. grazing is compelling, and speaking of the grazing study that Christine mentioned, they were able to, in that study with a lot of high intensity and movement of cattle across these sites, they were able to get down to some of the sites 20, 30, 40% cheatgrass, but they never ever quite got rid of it. Now that was early on in the study, so there's a ways to go with that study to know what they can do with it. But most of the grazing I've seen has never gotten rid of the seed bank. And as soon as you start to decrease or not be as involved with your management, it comes right back, especially with a year like this. So, but that said, a lot of our open spaces, grazing really isn't, unless we want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars putting in new fences. Grazing really isn't an option for places like Heil Valley Ranch, Rabbit Mountain, where we wouldn't have grazing anyway. So a lot of our open spaces, grazing really isn't an option for us to look at. So.
And according to the news, there's some very mean cows here in Boulder County.
Assertive, not aggressive. Other questions from POSAC? I have a couple, Dr. Nissen.
Sure.
How long does Daziflam last in the soil?
That's an interesting question. Soil samples have shown that there really is nothing left after about 3 years. You cannot detect it. That's using GC or LCMS-MS, which is, basically down to part per picomoles or picograms. So 10 to the minus 12th concentration. So, and that's what's confused a lot of people, why we're getting control that lasts so long without being able to detect it in the soil.
Yeah.
I did a little work right before I retired where we actually said, well, is there a chance that the seeds lying on the soil surface and those seeds that have no longer dehisced from the plant, they're going to get contacted with the highest possible concentration of herbicide? And is it possible that that's what you're essentially controlling 3 generations all at one time? 2 generations on the soil surface and a generation that's still hanging on the plant. So when we did that, what we found is that, yes, in fact, at very, very, very low concentrations, it still completely inhibits germination of the cheatgrass seed, and you can't wash it off. So we made the application, put the seeds in a spray chamber where we just had a nozzle go back and forth, putting on various amounts of water up to an inch, and plant the seeds out, and they still would not germinate. So what I think it is, the first 2 years you're getting some soil activity. What's giving you this really long residual control is you're controlling seeds on the plant and those lying on the soil surface and those that might be stuck in the thatch layer. So I think that's our best guess right now, because we can't explain how we get this kind of control when the best analytical technology we have can't detect the molecule.
Right. That's, essentially my question, so
Yeah.
thank you. This is Tony Lewis, POSAC, have there been studies done on, given that this is National Pollinator Week, on pollinators, aquatic insects, like any wildlife in any respect?
Well, yeah, we had a study that I think Boulder County funded part of it, didn't they? The Arthy's work, or was that totally? Yeah. So there's work done right here in Boulder County. So any plant that's established and has its roots down in the soil is not going to be impacted by this product. Now, if you're talking about does it affect trout or minnows or those kind of things, that work is all done by the EPA, and that information is available and is published as to what the MRL is for each one of these different species. So you can find out, did it affect water fleas, or does it affect diatoms or any of those kind of things? This is a very interesting mode of action, we call it. How does the herbicide actually work? Back when the cellulosic ethanol was going to be the solution to all of our energy problems, there was a lot of research done on how plants make cellulose, because if we understood that, we might understand how to take it apart, take it back to sugar, right? Well, it turns out that cellulose production is absolutely one of the most fascinating processes in plants that you can ever imagine. And it's just the machinery it's like the plant is laying down a radial tire, at this incredible rate in order to grow. So the really nice thing about this mode of action is that only organisms that are trying to produce cellulose are going to be impacted. So it's not impacting soil bacteria, fungi, or anything else. It's very specific just to organisms that rely on cellulose. And the thing is, it does not stop the plant from germinating. It's not a germination inhibitor. What it does is it keeps that primary root from establishing. All right, and occasionally you'll find a plant, a little cheatgrass plant that has survived, and it's got one little tiny root that made it down through the treated soil, and it's hanging on by just that single root. And if you go and pull up the plant, you realize it only has that one root that's on it. The rest didn't really grow, so it established just a single root.
So that leads to my maybe last question, which is when you use herbicides, we've seen in the past, you start to breed selectivity for those plants that can resist the herbicide.
Yeah, you guys are on top of it. Yeah.
And at what point in time after using Rejuvera are we going to see cheatgrass, Rejuvera resistant cheatgrass?
Very, very good question. Okay. Since you brought up resistance, then you guys appear to understand a little bit about the genetics of resistance. It takes time to select for those individuals, right? So if a plant was not impacted by the herbicide the first time you apply it, you would say that plant is tolerant. It's not resistant. Resistance develops over time, multiple applications. So that's a question that people have asked us, and it's the use pattern, the fact that we're only going to use it maybe once.
Right.
That site in Boulder County may only see this herbicide one time. So the chances of selecting for anything that's resistant is, it wouldn't even match the definition of resistance. If a plant survived, then it was tolerant. It wasn't resistance, because resistance takes multiple applications. So when we were thinking that we might need, we might get to 2 years and then we might have to put on a lower rate or something like that, we had greater concerns about the potential for resistance. But what we're seeing now is that there's no real difference between one application and a follow-up application. At the end of 5 or 6 years, the cheatgrass control looks identical. So from that standpoint, I never say never, because weeds have really fooled us. They have come up with some mechanisms of resistance that nobody thought about. But this should fall into a category for minimal risk of resistant individuals.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Last question, because I think I got a C in my range management class. If Daziflam is killing annuals and not perennials because of the root structure, what other annuals are at risk of being killed that may be either native or important for the grassland that would be killed by Daziflam as well, because they're annuals, not perennials?
Yeah, I can't give you any specific species. If you had something like, what's the real short-lived, the only native winter annual grass that we have? 6-week fescue. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, good peanut
I knew Jim would have. That's why he's
excellent.
He's my wingman back there. That would probably be impacted. Now, the difference is that it would probably only be impacted for 2 or 3 years. And what Boulder County and what other people have seen is that many of these annuals that are native have much harder seed coats and much longer residual life in the soil. And we've seen it, and other people have as well, that after 3 or 4 years without cheatgrass competition, we're starting to see a lot of native annuals show up. So if they tried to germinate, the year of application, they would probably be controlled. But here's the one thing. Broadleaves are significantly more tolerant than grasses. This is very weird that it's a very grass-specific type of herbicide. So there may be cases when there are large-seeded annuals who would have no problem at all germinating from depths in the soil where there is no Daziflam. So it wouldn't be impacting the hypocotyl of the plant. We do have some herbicides that are absorbed through the hypocotyl, but Daziflam is not one of them. And so people even thought about using this in crop species where you would plant a big seeded crop like corn or soybeans, you know, plant it down 2 or 3 inches and you'd have just this little tiny layer. So yes, it probably could impact them, but I think there's pretty good evidence here in Boulder County that, man, there are some very rare and unusual annuals that are coming up in these sites because there's no longer any competition from the cheatgrass.
Awesome, Joe.
Yeah, if I may, we have observed annuals coming through even in that first year when you would think that the rejuver would be having a huge impact on annuals. Snow on the mountain. Jim, can you help me out? I'm on the spotlight, so I'm not remembering what. But we had sunflowers, things of that nature. We do see them coming through in that very first year. I think one of the problems we kind of have with a little bit of this is that when we walk these sites and they're so full of cheatgrass, we don't really know what's supposed to be there. But our monitoring has demonstrated not only in the first year, but over time, an increase of all of these annuals and even rare plants. This past year, we were able to put a monitoring situation together where we are actually finding what Boulder County considers as rare plants on its list. We're starting to find them coming through these sites 4, 5, 6, 7 years later. I think one of the things to keep in mind with some of that is that not all seeds are going to germinate every year. Not all plants, certain plants need certain photo periods, they need certain moisture limits, they need certain soil temperatures. So, you know, I mean, they lay in the soil until they have that opportunity. And so I think the further out we get, as we're seeing right now, this will be our 8th growing season on a few of our earliest plots that we did. We're finding all sorts of new things coming up even this year with all of the rain that we're getting later here in the year, right? So we're into June with a lot of moisture. I think in 2021, most of the moisture was done by early June. But now with this extended moisture, it feels like we're finding even more plants coming up that we haven't seen before. So, you know, overall, I think the processes ecologically, once you remove the cheatgrass and you can reestablish the diversity, the original diversity there. And I can show you statistics from our monitoring. We've gone from some sites as low as 80 plants up to 160, 150 plants of diversity now across some of these sites. And I just have to believe over time, as these native plants are rebuilding the soil that they built here for 10,000 years, that you're going to see some of these changes start coming back for us, you know, once this cheatgrass is off the site and removed. So anyway, I mean, a lot of our monitoring is showing a lot of annual plants popping up on the ground, short-lived and monocarpic type plants, which are those plants that take a long time to actually produce seed, and they live for a long time before they actually produce seed. So we're seeing some really, really fantastic results across a lot of our sites. So
Thank you. Janet, do you want to ask another question or not?
Now, yeah, I'll ask this one other question. And it may not have to be answered tonight, but in this process, it'd be good. So when it comes to cheatgrass control or weed control, has any decision-making framework been applied to it? And what I'm thinking of is that the National Park Service and some other federal agencies, one that they're using now is called Resist, Accept, Direct. And so it's not necessarily relying on past situations. So the way this relates to cheatgrass, I mean, when do you decide you really need to control and how much control? I mean, if it's 10% at a site, do you need to control? Or just some kind of decision framework, and I think that would make it more transparent to people too. Yeah.
yeah, I have had some conversations with our senior ecologist at Boulder County, and we have been kind of talking about that threshold, you know, where we would maybe want to apply and then not apply. I think it's safe for me to say right now that we have had plenty of sites, you know, the sites are 40, 50% or more cheatgrass across those sites. So we haven't really had to worry about, I mean, we were going after more of the heavy, dense cheatgrass areas at this point, so we weren't really concerned about the lower level areas. But yeah, that is absolutely, as we progress with this program, that is something that I do plan on putting in place and working through our ecologists and some of my professionals around me to try to establish where we think that threshold is. And I think right now, we were kind of looking at maybe 15, 20%, somewhere in that range. But yeah, I mean, right now, that really hasn't been a concern up to this point because most of the sites that we've treated have been far greater in density than that. They've usually probably been up over 50% at least. and probably a little higher, over 60 or 70% in a lot of cases. So, but yeah, no, I agree with you. That is part of this process as we go through the revising of our weed management plan is to look at some of these things and actually give us a framework with which to work around on a lot of our different weed management activities that we do.
Okay.
I think it'd be interesting, Joe, if you could, you have some of these low-density sites just to track
Yes.
what happens.
Yeah.
I mean,
Like
does it stay at
without-
10% because it's got a really nice stand of western wheatgrass, or does it over time start moving up into that 30, 40, 50%? Problem is, you get a wet winter and a dry spring, and I think it could just explode because it will come up, produce seed, dry out the soil, the native plants will not be able to provide much competition. And then all of a sudden you're off to the races and you go from 10% to 60, something
But then
like
you'd
that.
know that, and yeah,
It would be nice to know that.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that'd be a great idea.
It's a great question, Janet, and I appreciate the thought in that. Since we're redoing the weed management plan, there's an opportunity to both to create a framework and to do some of the research to create the framework. And the transparency of that, I think, is what's really important, right?
Yeah.
People want to know. We've heard that clearly in POSAC, is our citizens want to know, how are we controlling this? Why? What's the framework for decision-making? To that end, I'm curious how, if intense fires are a problem, but less intense fire can help in cheatgrass management, how would we think about managing some of the areas that aren't thick with cheatgrass, that aren't 100% or 80%, but maybe are 30%, using fire as a tool rather than Rejuva?
Well, as I mentioned before, I had two students actually, Rachel and the one who was in the picture, and then
Abby
another
Road?
gal quite a few years ago, actually 2013. In fact, I remember that very clearly because we finished up harvesting at one of our sites right when the rain started to fall in 2013. Okay, so this site was comparing basically burned and not burned sites, and it was very evident that when you burn, you do get at least 1 year of very good suppression. But by the time you get to that second year, in all the cases that we had in this particular experiment, there was no difference between, if we didn't include a herbicide, let me say, because we were using plateau. So we had burning by itself and burning plus plateau. If you didn't do the burning plus plateau, the site where you just burned basically was just full of cheatgrass the next year.
From the residual seed bank?
Yeah. Yeah. So it makes, as I said, my student Rachel, who was in the picture, her whole part of her master's was trying to answer this question, which we got all the time, which is, should we burn and then apply the Rejuva, or could we apply it without burning? Because, burning's expensive. You get, you hire a crew to come in. I don't know, what do they charge you, $500 an acre or something?
I'm not sure. I do know that we did work with our forestry department on some of these sites because they did want to put in some prescribed burns, but they were on boundary fences that we couldn't really control the prescribed fire. So in lieu of doing prescribed fire, we did do applications of Rejuva, and it removed the cheatgrass. I think maybe the next step in that, because there is some fire ecology that we need in these hills and in our grasslands, right? I think the next step in that is potentially going back and trying to do prescribed burns on sites where we have already treated, just to kind of see what the burn pattern and what the results are from that. I know from my time at Kansas State in the Flint Hills, we do prescribed fire every year just to maintain the tall grass prairie. Otherwise, it becomes trees and shrubs and everything else. And one of the things that was always observed was that with fire culture burning across it, it released a whole bunch of nutrients into those sites. It kind of changed the soil profile for brief moments, and you would see new plants come, that responded to that came up out of the ground. We maintained the shrub on the site, and you also increase nutrition in the plants. Many grazing studies showed cows spending well, for instance, in one study, the fire actually got away from them into another pasture. And so as they monitored the pasture they were burning, they were also monitoring the pasture where the fire snuck in. And the neighbor's cows spent all their time on the burn spot that was created that summer in that part of the pasture. So I think maybe the next step for us with fire, prescribed fire, is to maybe go in and do some testing on, or do some burning on treated areas already and see what the result might be. It would not be for control of cheatgrass. It would just be for management of our ecological systems that require some amount of fire. So,
Great. Okay.
Tony, I've got, sorry.
You do have a question. Oh, great. All right.
It's late.
I just want to say, it is a little late, but that's okay. Like,
Yeah.
this is an important topic. We need to give it its full due. There's nothing better than being able to ask questions of a prof instead of the other way around. Yeah. And so,
academic credit for this.
exactly. I want to take the time, since we have an expert, to really, go as deep as we need. And I appreciate your patience in the audience.
How are you holding up?
I'm doing good.
Good. I'm going to ask because
It's
my
getting close to
neighbor,
beer 30 though.
right?
It's close.
I think my neighbor might lose his mind if I didn't ask the question. He's a huge fan of Alan Savory and HMI. And so I just wanted to bring it up. One of the slides had bare ground as like what we're looking for. And so I just wanted to ask, like in that world of HMI and Savory, they want cover. And so I just wanted to see if
Well,
you,
okay, it was bare ground because that's what's supposed to be in between the bunch grasses. So it was kind of a close-up, but if you pulled back, you would have seen that there's like a patch of western here, there's a slender wheatgrass here. So I was not really trying to suggest that bare ground is, we need some bare ground because that's what this system, how it works, is that bare ground is sites for pollinators. That's why fires generally in the past never got out of hand because there was bare ground and the fire was very spotty and very low intensity. And so bare ground is never a good thing, but in our ecosystem here, with all the bunch grasses, we only have a few grasses, native grasses that actually are sod forming. Most of them are bunch grasses. And the intent and the idea is that in between these bunches, there should be bare ground. So
I might disagree. Disagree with the no. But one of the things we do see with the bare ground, though, is that is opportunities for some of these forbs, right? I mean, it does create growing spaces for those forbs, kind of fill in some of those areas. But like he said, I believe, according to Orthy, who did the pollinator study for us at Boulder County, said that over 80% of our bees are ground nesting bees. And so you can just imagine, and one of the things she did note on that was the fact that we did have clean bare ground in between plants that they could access and readily utilize versus something that's 3 or 4 inches deep in cheatgrass litter. So, and that was actually done on our Colt property. So, yeah.
That's
anyway.
great. Thank you. Christine, you have some questions.
Yeah, Christine Johnson, POSAC. You said that there's information available about impacts to other organisms or to water or aquatic organisms. I think because it is a relatively new herbicide, it would be interesting to access that. It'd be interesting. I'm saying it'd be interesting for us to access that and see what the impacts are. I also wanted to mention, I think, Joe, you're doing a tour of some sites with conips on the 29th. Is that?
Yes, we are.
Is that open to, I mean, if people from here wanted to join that? Because I'm going, I'm really interested.
Are you already signed up to go? Yeah, I mean, I suppose it would just be a matter of getting with Pat Butler and Jackie Romali, and I mean, we can make the room if you guys, or we can even do a separate trip if you guys have the time and want to find the time. We could just do a separate trip that would suit everybody here. And the 2 members that are missing tonight, I'd be very happy to take you out and show you that stuff. Something else I was also going to mention is I know we hear things about water contamination and things like that. One of the things I think that gets lost in some of this is that these herbicides provide labels that tell us where and when to treat and how to treat with these herbicides. This is a terrestrial herbicide. We typically are never anywhere around water. I maybe shouldn't say never, but I mean, we're usually fairly large distances from any kind of water-based sources. And if there is, then we put the appropriate buffers in to help make sure there is no contamination of any kind. I do know that through the ecological risk assessment that the EPA did, and then that the Forestry Service, U.S. Forest Service just followed up with as they were trying to approve Rejuva for their Forest Service lands. It is actually stated in the ecological risk assessment that it is practically non-toxic to honeybees and invertebrates. And it is also says that is true for waterborne insects. So as far as pollinators and things like that, I don't feel we would have any impact of any kind with pollinators or insects, just kind of based on that. And that's accessible. You can Google that, USDA ecological risk assessment. You can find it. And if you have a brain that wants to sort through all of it, I've been spending a lot of time on it, more time than I ever thought I would. But there's a lot of really good information in there that tells me that this product is a pretty safe product. So.
Thanks. Sounds like an action item, maybe a site visit for POSAC.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to take you out.
Cool. Christine?
The last question I have is whether anyone has any financial conflicts of interest in this.
Well, I have.
Closer to the mic, please.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, like anybody, I use this joke. I hope it's not considered offensive, but I consider being a university professor to be the world's second oldest profession, if you understand the meaning of that. I've taken money from anybody who had it, whether it's a company, the federal government. I've taken money from CDOT. I shouldn't say I've taken. I have been granted money to do projects. I did a project with Walt Disney's son-in-law, Ron Miller, on a ranch he owns by Gunnison. So, I mean, just because I took money, and I don't know anybody that wouldn't essentially be willing to work with a company. What I'm saying is that when it came to this product, we went to Bayer. They had no idea what they had because they were worried about pistachios in California and vineyards. They had no interest. They had no products, any other products in the range and pasture. So it was not a small feat to convince them that this product had a fit. So I have received no money for that. I wish I did. I think they owe me a whole lot of money since they're selling it for, it's not cheap. But it really has turned out to be probably one of the best projects I've worked on in the 30 years I've been in weed science. So, and like I said, I worked for Walt Disney's on his ranch. It didn't make me a movie star. So anyway, that was a fun project, by the way. So anyway, if you get the gist, at CSU, my yearly budget for research, teaching, and extension was about $4,000. So you are basically given a phone and a desk. And then somebody calls you up and says, what account do you want us to charge your phone calls to? So it's all about the money. And so if you get money to do interesting projects, I think it's always worth it. And I've never been asked in the 30 years, I was never once approached about manipulating any data or anything of that nature. In fact, companies want you to tell them the absolute truth, because if they label a product that causes injury or is somehow not what it's cracked up to be, that's liability for them. You don't have to look too much farther than some of the lawsuits that have been settled lately to realize that they are very risk averse and they want to know everything negative and positive about any product that they market. So that'd be my statement. Yes, I have taken money from Bayer, but I've taken money from about every other company and every other source of funding. And if some little old lady on the corner wanted to give me some money to work on something, I would do my best to do whatever I needed to do. So it's not easy life as far as coming up with money. You have these great students. Those are three of my most recent students there in the picture who helped me recreate the famous cover of an album.
Thank you.
Thanks.